iTunes was once the most popular place to browse, buy, and listen to music, but that was about 15 years ago, and a lot has changed since then. In fact, many people today consider iTunes to be a bloated, slow, bug-infested application that's become the victim of its own success. So what exactly happened to iTunes? Well, in order to answer this question, we have to go back to before iTunes ever existed. This is Greg with Apple Explained, and if you want to help decide which video topics I cover, make sure you're subscribed, and these voting polls will show up right in your mobile activity feed. And don't forget to check out our new iGenius plush doll at appleexplained.com. Before the iTunes Music Store was around, major music labels were having a huge problem with piracy. People were ripping music from CDs and sharing digital song files to every corner of the globe by using peer-to-peer file sharing applications like Napster. But most people weren't pirating music because they were criminals. They were pirating music because there was no other way to download digital song files in those days. There was no digital music marketplace. If you wanted the latest single from Eminem or Beyonce, you'd have to make a trip to your local record store and spend $15 or $20 to buy the entire album, even if that single was the only song you wanted. So you can imagine the appeal of hopping on Napster and downloading individual songs for free from the comfort of your own home, even if it was technically illegal. And because things like the internet and the iPod grew in popularity so quickly, so did digital music piracy, and it caught record labels off guard. Their initial approach to combat piracy was to make examples out of the worst file sharers. They did this by taking legal action and threatening the same treatment to any other pirate. But this warning fell on deaf ears since it just wasn't possible to prosecute hundreds of thousands of Napster users. So then they got another idea. What if music could be copy protected so that it wouldn't be possible to rip CDs in the first place? But before the music industry could follow through with that plan, they were approached by Steve Jobs, who introduced a completely new way to combat music piracy. The concept was that you can't stop people from pirating music, but you can discourage it by offering an easier, more convenient way to find and download digital music at a reasonable price. And looking back, this approach may seem obvious, but it was actually pretty radical. And initially, many record label executives refused to cooperate, since they believed Apple would be the only company benefiting from the deal. Labels were afraid of losing even more of their dwindling revenue by selling songs individually for 99 cents, rather than selling albums for $15 or $20. So to help persuade record labels to give the iTunes Music Store a chance, Apple made it available only on the Mac. That way the concept could be tested with a smaller audience and would cause very little damage to the music industry if it failed. But as we all know, that wasn't the case at all. When the iTunes Music Store launched, it was an instant success, selling 1 million music downloads in its first week, despite only being available to Mac users. 5 months later, Apple would release a Windows version of the iTunes Store, which led to the company's domination of the digital music marketplace. And despite drawbacks of iTunes, like purchased songs only being compatible with Apple devices, it proved to be the biggest player in digital music sales year after year. But this is when things started to take a turn for the worst. As iTunes grew in popularity, it adopted new features and functionality that contributed to the application becoming bloated, because what started as a music jukebox and digital music marketplace eventually became an iPod management system, a podcasting client, a video and software marketplace, an iPhone administration tool, a social network, and a music streaming service all rolled into one. There were many people who warned Apple that giving iTunes too much functionality could result in a complex and convoluted application, but their words were ignored. For example, just a few days before the original iPhone was introduced in 2007, Pete Mortensen with Wired published an article predicting Apple would create an application for the sole purpose of handling data transfers between the upcoming iPhone and a computer. Because remember, back in those days, you couldn't simply set up an iPhone on its own. You had to activate it by connecting to a computer with iTunes and sync all of your data between the two through a USB cable. And Mortensen figured Apple would create a dedicated application to handle the syncing process, kind of like what iCloud does today, except on your computer instead of a remote server. Mortensen said, Imagine a single, lightweight application focused solely on data transfers and media previews. As you initiate a sync, it detects all the new data on your phone and launches transfer-only versions of the iLife apps needed to work with them. All your podcasts get instantly loaded, your photos are imported, sorted, and posted to your website. Just hit OK and watch it go. But that wasn't what Apple had in mind. Instead, they gave iTunes the responsibility of syncing data, and this resulted in an endless amount of bugs and complications that plagued the iTunes syncing process for years. Here are just a few examples. iTunes getting stuck on the waiting for items to copy step, iTunes not syncing album art correctly, iTunes Wi-Fi sync not working for iOS users, iTunes 12 crashing while syncing apps, iTunes thinking that a device's storage is full when it really isn't, and a host of unknown error messages that were notoriously difficult to solve. And matters were only made worse in 2010 when Apple decided the iPad should also sync with iTunes. At that point, iTunes was responsible for syncing contacts, calendar events, Safari bookmarks, notes, email accounts, iWork documents, music, TV shows, movies, podcasts, books, ringtones, photos, and more. Keep in mind, this functionality was on top of everything iTunes had already been responsible for, and the bloat showed no signs of slowing down. Shortly after the additional iPad support, Apple introduced a new layer to iTunes called Ping. Now, you may not be familiar with Ping since it only lasted 2 years, but it was a music-oriented social networking service intended to help users share and discover new music with friends. But it faced difficulties from day one. Apple hadn't received permission to include Facebook integration, despite that being one of its headlining features. Spam links were a persistent issue since Apple didn't set up any content filters, and fake artist accounts were created by scammers to bait users. So in short, Ping was a complete failure, and thankfully it was removed from iTunes in 2012. But Ping proved just how unrestrained Apple was in loading up iTunes with even more features rather than offering a faster, simpler, more manageable application. Now by 2012, users finally received a synchronization service from Apple that worked as advertised, and it was called iCloud. I'm sure you've heard of it since it's the most successful cloud-based service Apple has ever offered. But iCloud suffered from technical issues thanks to a feature called iTunes Match, later renamed iCloud Music Library. You see, the feature was supposed to scan a user's iTunes music library, including tracks copied from CDs, and match them to higher quality lossless tracks in the iTunes Store. Then it would upload all those tracks to iCloud so the user could access their music library from any device. It sounded great in theory, but caused absolute havoc when people started using iTunes Match for themselves. Here's one user's experience from a Cult of Mac article by Rob Lefebvre. Discussions user Tough Ghost explains that everything was fine with his 13,000 song iTunes library until he installed iTunes 12.2 on his Mac and allowed it to enable iCloud Music Library. All of a sudden, it starts overwriting my album art with completely wrong art. Example, Weezer showed art for a Radiohead album on both my iMac and my iPhone, screwing up metadata by putting random songs in albums where they didn't belong. There was a cursive album where the first track was listed as a Foo Fighters song. When he clicked to listen to a song, it would play a completely different one, like the metadata for the files were completely incorrect. This left many people struggling to recover their original iTunes libraries and advising others to never enable iCloud Music Library in the first place. In the early 2000s, iTunes revolutionized the way people purchased and managed music, but almost a decade after its introduction, the market began to change once again. Except this time, Apple wasn't leading the revolution. Instead, it was a Swedish company called Spotify who helped usher in the music streaming era. They brought their service to the US in 2011, and as you can see from this graph, iTunes music sales began to decline just 2 years later. It turned out users were comfortable renting music for a monthly fee since it came with incredible advantages, like the convenience of listening to any song in the service's catalog from any device without taking up any storage space. And as Spotify exploded in popularity, Apple knew they needed to offer a music streaming service of their own. But this left many people to speculate how exactly Apple would implement their service. Many assumed the company would give it a dedicated app, separate from iTunes. But similar to the iPhone syncing scenario, Apple decided to squeeze their entire music streaming service into an already overstuffed iTunes. Here's what Micah Singleton with The Verge had to say about it in 2015. On the desktop, Apple decided against building a standalone app and instead shoved Apple Music into iTunes. It's less than stellar. Nobody likes using iTunes. For the last 15 years, iTunes has been a necessary evil if you wanted to have music locally stored in halfway decent fashion on your computer. And now that it's integrated with Apple Music, there's no escaping iTunes. And because of this tight integration with iTunes, users began experiencing headaches while trying to do things like downloading tracks for offline listening, because that feature required iCloud Music Library to be turned on, and some users who did had their libraries completely ruined, proving that Apple still hadn't resolved the issues with iCloud Music Library, formerly iTunes Match, since its release 4 years earlier. And this isn't even considering how cumbersome and slow Apple Music is, largely due to being integrated into iTunes. Singleton also touched on this in his review of the service, saying, "Apple Music on the desktop is slow and heavy, and has more than a few times refused to stream music for me. If you want to put a song or album from Apple Music on repeat, you have to go on a scavenger hunt through the menu bar, and it may or may not work. iTunes feels like it was built for the last generation of apps. Spotify's desktop app is nothing to write home about, but it feels much snappier and lighter than iTunes ever has." And I think that's a major reason why many users, myself included, prefer using Spotify over Apple Music. It feels faster, more intuitive, and keeps track of music playback between my Apple products, so I can continue listening to a song on my iPhone that I started on my Mac, something that Apple's own streaming service still doesn't do. And this has left many users clamoring for a dedicated Apple Music app built from the ground up with an emphasis on performance and continuity between devices, rather than a music service bogged down by the mess that iTunes has become. Today, iTunes is a bloated resource hog that many users would rather avoid. And with the popularity of music streaming at its peak, many are wondering what the future of iTunes might be, or if it has a future at all. There are already rumors of Apple announcing the shutdown of their iTunes Music Store by the end of this month, and that could give the company an opportunity to go back to the drawing board and reimagine their approach to music management, perhaps introducing a new music application or a completely revolutionized version of iTunes. But either way, I think we can all agree that Apple needs to make some drastic changes to salvage iTunes' legacy. Now, if you want a behind-the-scenes look at what happens on this channel, check out the Patreon page where you can ask me questions and chat with the community, and don't forget about our awesome new iGenius plush doll available at appleexplained.com. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.